Of course, there are two more lectures in this series. One is going to look at the unsavory and other stories at Michigan State University, their archives, and the final one is going to explore the Hemingway family up north. So we hope that you'll join us for all those events. But I'd like to turn the podium over now to Leslie Edwards, who has been guiding, shepherding, growing the archives here at Cranbrook for more than a decade. Leslie.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight. We're excited to start this lecture series, and hopefully you'll all enjoy the letterhead exhibition. One of the things we did with the speakers was ask them to include letterhead in their presentations. So they'll either start and end with letterhead, or in Joel's case, he was kind enough to dig through his own archival materials and supplement his slides with a spattering of really cool letterhead. Joel is senior curator for the Detroit Historical Society, which oversees the Detroit Historical Museum, the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, and 250,000 artifacts in the city of Detroit's collection. He was raised in the Detroit area, has studied journalism, history, archaeology, and archival management. I like to say that Joel has a Cranbrook connection. Many people do. Joel married into the Cranbrook community 25 years ago. His wife, Linda, is a Kingswood School graduate, and she is head of the upper school libraries here at Cranbrook. Her parents and most of her siblings also attended Cranbrook, and her mom, Martha, works in development at Cranbrook House. And she drives her nephew and two nieces to school every day here, so it's a 3-generational Cranbrook family. History is Joel's second career. For decades, he worked as a graphic artist and presentation designer. And if you've ever been in the Kingswood School in the hallway, many years ago we met when Joel put together a really cool display of the history of Kingswood School for us. I asked Joel what he likes best about his job, because that's what interests me, is to know why people get into this profession. And he said, hands down, it's the variety. And I have to say, I 100% agree with you. No day is the same. Even when we come to work thinking we're going to do one thing, we do everything usually but the one thing we thought we were going to do. He says in the morning he'll do conservation on an 18th century British cannon, which was pulled out of the Detroit River and was a collaboration with the Detroit Police Dive Team and the Institute of Science here at Cranbrook. In the afternoon, he'll do oral history interviews for an upcoming exhibition about the Detroit riots. And in the evening, he'll talk to folks like us about the crazy place Detroit was during the 1920s. No 2 days are the same. So, before Joel gets started, I was tasked with seeing how Joel's presentation would compare with the collections that we have at Cranbrook. So just very briefly, I have to say that, of course, Cranbrook has no connection with Detroit whatsoever. Ha ha. The Booth and Scripps families obviously were in Detroit, and they were in the newspaper business, so we do have letterhead relating to the newspaper business. Here's one from 1901. Joel is going to talk quite a bit about the variety of companies and businesses and manufacturing industries that we had in Detroit. And you can see here a couple of examples from our own collection. Obviously, we have civic and political related letterhead. Now, when George Booth was building Cranbrook, he purchased many objects for furnishing Cranbrook House and many of the buildings here on campus. And we have some really beautiful examples of the companies that he was using here in Detroit, like this one, and these as well. Finally, Joel's going to touch on Prohibition, what was happening with that industry here in Detroit. And what I want to say is In 1853, Henry Goff Booth, this is not Henry Goff Booth, this is Henry Wood Booth, not to be confused. That Henry Goff is Henry Wood's father. He opened Booth & Sons in St. Catharines, Ontario, and then 2 years later they moved to Toronto. It was a brass and copper works, and it manufactured many things, including utensils, stills, and brewing kettles for the distillery business. Now, this is not exactly letterhead relating to Prohibition, because I really don't think that exists. You know, the speakeasies had those little sliding doors to see who was there. I don't really think they had letterhead. But maybe you found some, Joel, I'm not sure. So anyway, son Henry worked in the business. By the 1870s, he was involved in supervising outside construction and distillery equipment for the growing wine and brandy district at Niagara. But he really wrestled with himself over this. When he joined the Good Templars, he pledged not only to abstain himself, but to ardently discourage the manufacture and use of alcohol. However, he had a family to feed, and in his words, self-preservation is the first law of nature. So for over 50 years, he was an advocate of the discrimination between distilled spirits, which he considered dangerous drugs, and fermented beverages, which was a wholesome business if used in moderation. He made a lifelong study of partial prohibition or drink regulation and wrote numerous articles, many of which were published in the Detroit newspapers, pamphlets and sermons as well. So with that, we're going to get back to Joel's presentation. After all, we're here to hear him speak. So with that, Joel, I'd like to welcome you, and everybody, our applause for Joel and Boomtown.
Well, thank you. No, that's all right. I learned something there. I didn't realize that somebody could actually say, I like beer, but I don't like whiskey, and get away with it. That's quite an approach. When Leslie asked me to get this together, it was wonderful. It was a nice chance to take a presentation I've given many times and really kind of spice it up. The one thing you don't know is that my previous occupation, well, I guess you did mention that, was as a graphic artist. And so when I was doing that, I've designed many a letterhead over time. So I have a great appreciation for it. And frankly, I like the stuff they were doing in the 1890s, in 1900, a lot better than some of the really fast stuff where they take a wonderful company name and shorten it to about 3 letters and put it in a fancy font and you're done. I kind of miss the old days. Detroit during the 1920s was an incredible place. You can see from this picture here, this was probably about 1928. The buildings have grown. We've got a very, very effective public transportation system. The unemployment rate is very low at this point. People are coming from all over the world to work in Detroit. From that aspect, it's a wonderful place. You want to talk public corruption? We had it. I mean, compared with 100 years later now, we can't even, it's laughable what they had then. The public corruption in the halls of the city, the public corruption that was going on because of Prohibition, it was an interesting time to be here. The best of times, the worst of times. People, we get, as you probably do, Leslie, we get inquiries from all over the country, all over the world, and they say, tell us about Detroit during the Golden Age. And as I mentioned to Larry earlier, my question is, what was the Golden Age? Was it the 1980s when things were flying high right before the big crash? Was it the 1950s and 60s when Detroit metal was ultra cool? Was it the 1920s? And arguably there are a lot of people who would put their money into this basket. I go back a little bit farther. I really like starting, the 1890s was a wonderful time in Detroit. And I think with any story, if you're going to look at the 1920s, we got to start earlier. So let's do that. In the letterhead vein, Leslie beat me by what, 4 years? 2 years? This was the oldest letterhead I could find, 1857 in our collection. Before this, people really didn't think about that. Advertising hadn't developed. Advertising didn't really develop till the 1880s, and then, of course, the 1920s and the 1950s were incredible advances in advertising. So this is kind of a big step to go to a point where you have enough confidence in your business that you go out and get a letterhead pressed for it. Starting about the Civil War, this is Detroit. And between the Civil War and 1900, it didn't grow by much. You can see that the outside of the green area there, anybody who's been to Detroit and spent time there recognizes that as Grand Boulevard. And Grand Boulevard was the park at the outskirts of town. That was out in the country at that point, and you would go out there to drive around. There was a little bit of development off to the east in Hamtramck Township, and there was a little bit of development to the north in an area that we now kind of call the Boston Edison District. But that's Detroit before 1900. That doesn't mean it wasn't quite a town. Now, this is 1875. The City Hall, the building there in the center, tallest building in town, had only been open for 5 years. Most of what you're looking at are Civil War era buildings. This is 10 years after the Civil War. But if you look at some of the signs, and it's nice to have them this big, if you look at some of the signs, over to the side we've got the G&R Macmillan Company that's doing groceries. There are some people selling other stuff, but most important probably scales. And below that, we've got nails and glass, and over to the side here, stoves. And these are pretty important things as we go forward in Detroit's history. We've got some letterhead from the G&R Macmillan Company there. We've got some from a company that sold horse nails. The Ducharme Company was the biggest hardware firm in Detroit at the time. Fletcher Hardware not far behind that, the Detroit City Glass Works, and maybe most important, the standard computing scales. When I was a kid, you used to go into the butcher shop, and the guy would measure out whatever mom asked for and put it up on a scale that had a round cylinder that turned based on how much the weight was, and it told him exactly how much the price was. No electronics necessary. This is a process that was developed in Detroit, eventually was co-opted by other companies, probably most notably Toledo Scale, but that was developed in Detroit. Detroit was big into scales, and I like to say that just to get us into Detroit was so much more than automobiles. Of course, the stove business, we made more stoves than any place else in the world, and that got to be really important later on when we became the center for automobile production. Why did it happen? Lots of cities were making automobiles, but by 1915, Detroit had 125 companies making automobiles or automobile parts. No other city could say that. And it had a lot to do with the stove business. Or if we go to Eber Ward, Eber was he got into the sailing business, then he got into the lumber business, and eventually he was the first guy to make what we call pneumatic steel. Also known as Bessemer steel. He got the patent from a guy named Kelly down south and tried it in Wyandotte and was very successful with it. And because of that, we got into making all kinds of things. We made rail cars and wheels more than any place else, but the electric light stuff that you had a great piece of letterhead from a company that distributed that, and steel springs and forges all over town. We had forges, which is why people started, we had the biggest facilities in the country for making stoves and making brass and copper and wire screening. Detroit got into working with metals sooner than most other cities, and we were in the right spot to do it. We also had the opportunity of taking advantage of the Great Lakes. We were right in the middle. The iron ore was to the north, the coal was to the south, and if you put them together, you can make steel like crazy, and we did. We made more ships than any place else on the Great Lakes. We made more rail cars than any place else in the country. Detroit became the center of shipbuilding and the center of Great Lakes passenger traffic. This is where most of the large passenger steamers were based out of. There were a couple based out, there was one based out of Chicago, major one based out of Milwaukee, over on Lake Michigan that really dominated. But as far as everything else, as far as up to Lake Superior, over to Buffalo, Detroit was the center of that activity, probably spearheaded by the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company, but there was also the White Star Line, there was the of course, I'm blanking on all of them. There was another one known as the Red Star Line. There was the coal line. There were several lines that were running as far as Mackinac, as far as Duluth, over to Buffalo. And those were the big lines. Then there were the smaller ones. We'll touch on that a little later. But you could get a trip around the Great Lakes right up until 1967 when the Georgian Bay Line, originally based in Chicago, ended up being based in Detroit. It finally closed. Of course, we got into the refrigerator business. The two biggest refrigerator manufacturers were based here. We got into the adding machine business. Burroughs moved from St. Louis because they were having union problems. They were having union problems, so they came to Detroit. We don't think about that now, but right up until World War II, Detroit was the least unionized city in the country. It really helped a lot when we wanted to build things. Of course, the Kresge Company got into business figuring out how to sell things less expensively. The Detroit Photographic Company is probably one of the greatest stories and something you may want to take home with you. They got into printing postcards, and in the 1870s, 1880s, people started to travel. They didn't want to spend a lot of money. It's when tchotchkes got started, buying the little China things. But really, if you wanted to send something home to say, hey, wish you were here, what you wanted was a postcard. And that's what the Detroit Photographic Company did. They sent people around the world taking pictures. And those photographs now reside in the Library of Congress. They're available to all of us for free. It's fun to go to the Detroit Photographic Company's collection and look at them. It's a priceless resource. But it also was big business. And we had a lot of printers here. Calvert Litho, I think I might mention that later, but Calvert Litho was based here, along with several other lithographic companies, and they made those letterheads. Probably my favorite one is the sheet music business. Most people don't realize we had the biggest sheet music business in the world, which was a company started by a guy named C.J. Whitney and eventually bought by a guy named Jerome Remick. The Remick bandshell down on Belle Isle is kind of a testimonial to his largesse in the music business. But if you look at these names, this is 1890. These are like the biggest. These are the hits. These are the million sellers. And if you think about it, back then, we didn't have radio. We didn't have phonographs. Everybody played an instrument, or somebody in the family played an instrument, and they probably played the piano. And if we think about these things, we've got apps for our phones. These are the apps for your piano, okay? If you got a piano, you can't do anything without the sheet music. And Jerome Remick sold more than anybody else in the world. All those names, all those song titles, I could sing darn near all of them, but I won't because my family's in the house. He had guys like George Gershwin and Harry Warren in his stable of writers. This is important, and he was the biggest right up until Irving Berlin really stole that thunder in the 1930s. We had the largest three pharmaceutical companies. Of course, Parke Davis was the one we all noticed. This is their headquarters here. But we also had Stearns, was another big one. Crops, well, there's Stearns, and Farron Williams, which was kind of a precursor to Stearns. The Berry brothers, big manufacturers of varnish and paint. And then Boydell, the second only to the Berry brothers, based here in Detroit. Seeds, Dexter Ferry got into the manufacturing and the marketing of seeds. And he didn't market them in bulk, he put them in little packets so that somebody who was planting a family garden could do this. And it was an idea that took off. His time was right. 1870s is when he got started. Late 1880s is when his business absolutely exploded, and he was able to sell these small packets of seeds across the country. One of those companies that's still in business today. I mentioned the lithography companies. We had several. Detroit was a big printing town. Really, right up until the 1970s, Detroit was a big printing town. But Calvert Litho was one of the largest in the country, and certainly responsible for most of the fancy graphics that we're going to see out in the hall before 1930, I would guess. Big town for making engines. We had the forges, we had the metal technology. We started making marine engines, not car engines, but marine engines. Most of the guys who made cars later, Ford and Buick and Charles Brady King and Olds, all made engines to go in boats first. Olds said that the poorest place to test an engine was in an automobile. So he put them in boats. And we started making these. The Kale Company, which was really known for making scales and making penny slot machines, got into making outboard motors. The Waterman Company, the first practical outboard motor that was manufactured for mass consumption, was made by Cameron Waterman right here in Detroit. We've got his original prototype in our museum. The Stralinger Company, I saw Kermath earlier. You had some Kermath letterhead. That was another. We had a number, about probably a dozen engine companies making them. And if we're making engines, we might as well make boats, right? So Chris Graff got started here. There was also some lesser-known names. Gar Wood, who was a racer, but he also made boats. John Hacker was a big manufacturer. He had a plant in Mount Clemens for a while. The Liggett Company downriver, the Gregory Company, Ed Gregory. The Gregory Company is still on Jefferson now. They were making boats. These were, the fastest boats in the world. If you wanted a race, you came to Detroit, because Detroit had the fast boats. That's going to come in handy later. What's that? Yeah, Prohibition. Think Prohibition, okay? Tobacco, probably the thing people don't realize about Detroit is we were the biggest tobacco manufacturer north of Tampa. And this is both cigars, which were fashionable and cool, cigarettes, which were fashionable and not very cool, and chewing tobacco. That kind of thing was all manufactured in Detroit by a dozen different companies. This is just a variety of the things we did. We had aircraft. I don't think anybody realizes that the Boeing family lived here, and at one time Lockheed had its headquarters in the Detroit Aircraft Corporation, which was based here in Detroit. An idea was to create kind of a General Motors of aircraft. And we had it. It didn't last. Kansas City kind of got an upper hand, and then Seattle absolutely won that war. But for a long time, with Ford making aircraft and Stinson making aircraft, Detroit was the center of aircraft building too. Lots of other companies I threw in the evening news just for, local flavor. But we had the printing companies, we had everything. We had 4 organ companies were based here and 3 companies that made pianos. Detroit was very musical starting before the Civil War, and then just the basic little ones. There's a guy with a livery company, and that's the fanciest livery house I've ever seen. If you're going to keep your horse, I want to keep my horse there. Detroit River was the busiest river in the world, the busiest waterway. In 1907, the Detroit River carried more freight than the Port of London and the Port of New York put together. And we don't think about it. Most of it didn't stop here as it was at London and New York. Most of it was passing through to Cleveland or Buffalo or up to Mackinac or over to Chicago, but it all went by here. A boat would go by the Belle Isle Lighthouse about every 5 minutes, one way or another. Busiest waterway in the world. Here's Cass Avenue, which frankly got a pretty bad rap when I was in college. But it was a pretty place to live. Detroit had a lot of money. We had the lumber money. We had the railroad money. There was a lot of capital going here. If you thought about it, you were an Eastern capitalist. There wasn't much west of St. Louis. Your options were Milwaukee, Cleveland, Detroit, St. Louis. And that maybe Pittsburgh, too, thrown in there. But Detroit was a good spot to draw money, and we did draw money. We had several banks that were very prosperous at this time. We're back to the City Hall. This is 1890. All right, no longer the tallest building in town. You can see the tower of the Federal Building off to the side and the Cadillac Hotel, which sits where the book Cadillac is now. Detroit started to grow. We've bought Belle Isle late 1870s. It's now a park by the mid-1880s, 1890. We've got people by the thousands that are going down and having fun. Relaxation and leisure time has arrived. So people are now having fun in boats. We made lots of small boats, as well as building the big ones. Lots of small boats, rowboats. The Michigan Steel Boat Company, the Murtaugh Canoe Works were making boats. And we had guys that rowed. Detroit's got the oldest rowing club in the world, in the Detroit Boat Club. They're still rowing today. They started in 1839, but they were one of like 10 that were racing up and down the river. And we still have that. E-Course and Cranbrook, I guess, and they've got it over at St. Mary's. We still have rowing here, but these were guys getting together in large rowboats, gigs they would call them, and doing some hefty racing on the river. We also had the big excursion boats, not the big cruise boats. These are a little bit smaller. Think Boblo boat. Okay, boats that would go up the St. Clair River, go down the Detroit River, go to the Sandusky Islands, Lake Erie Islands up to the flats. Here's Joe Bedore's. Joe Bedore's is probably the most notorious of about 20 resorts that were stretched up the St. Clair River along Harson's Island. And you could go up there for 50 cents. You could go to Port Huron and back on a hot summer day. There was no air conditioning. In fact, the city was pretty smoky. But you could get on a ferry crossing Lake St. Clair. It was 20 miles across Lake St. Clair, so a couple of hours. And then you could either stop at a place like Joe Bedore's for lunch or overnight or a week and stop and fish and hunt. It was a wonderful time. Or just keep going on to Port Huron. The boat would stay for an hour or so. You could enjoy Port Huron, turn around and take the boat back, all for 50 cents. It was a wonderful day to spend a great afternoon. I threw this picture in. This is, again, the Park Davis headquarters, but I threw this in just to remind everybody that it was a smoky place. We showed all the forges, all of the factories, all of the places, and those were just the businesses. Most of the homes were also burning coal, too. So Detroit, we've just gotten to the electric light. We're just getting to that point where we're not using kerosene anymore. So Detroit is kind of a smoky place. Lots of pictures you'll see. You're looking up Woodward Avenue, and you can't see more than 3 or 4 blocks. Best of times, worst of times. So, Boomtown. We had Detroit up until the Civil War. And then it grew just a little bit by 1918, end of World War I. Okay, so we've added a little bit down into the Delray neighborhood, kind of over toward Dearborn. We've added a little bit out into Grosse Pointe Township, just shy of what's now called Grosse Pointe. We're building along the river. We haven't spread to the north yet. Of course, there were people living up here, but we really didn't have the population. We hadn't become a city yet. Now, 1918 to 1925, this is what happened. 7 years. Okay, most of what happened was the result of the automobile business. We had all those wonderful businesses, a very varied economy before that. Everybody got into the automobile business. Like I said, 1915, 125 companies were doing it, and they were taking the employees of a lot of these other companies. Steamship companies had a hard time hiring people because the automobile companies paid more. And because they needed more workers, this is what the population did. 1900, we had 300,000 people. 30 years later, we got 1.5 million. And a lot of that happened between 1910 and 1930. That was really quite a remarkable growth, not just in the city, but in the region. You can see that the regional numbers are almost the same. It's when a lot of our suburbs really started popping up. People really started thinking about moving beyond the city limits back in 1920. Growing faster than any other city in the country. Per capita. We are putting in more telephone lines, more electrical lines, more sewer lines, more water lines, more roads, more public lighting, and then all the buildings that go with them. We were known for our single-family homes. The 1915, 1920s changed Detroit's outlook. I mean, the way the city was laid out as an urban region. Before that, Detroit neighborhoods were very mixed. You might have a couple of houses, and then you'd have a corner store, and across the street would be a church, and then you might even have a cemetery, and beyond that would be a tool and die shop, and across the street would be another shop and another corner store. There was really a mix of things in the neighborhoods. With the 1920s, we started putting up block after block after block of single home, and people loved that. It was something Detroit was known for, but we also built the multiple dwellings. The apartment buildings went up there. There were so many people coming into town, you couldn't go wrong. More hotel rooms than any place else, mostly because of Prohibition. We'll touch on that a little later. Conferences and conventions love going where there's alcohol, and it worked for our hotels. We had a big influx of immigrants. I've mentioned that. Most of the buildings we call iconic to Detroit were built during the 1920s. It really was a wonderful time to do that. Here's a picture of the waterfront in 1910. Tallest building there is the Ford building, built in 1909. You see just off to the side the tower of the old Federal building, but other than that, there's not much that's very tall. Maybe mostly old Civil War era, and maybe a few that are a little taller. So just 15 years later, looking up Woodward Avenues, this is what we've got. All of a sudden, the Majestic building's gone up. You can see the buildings marching down, the Fife Shoe building down in Grand Circus, kind of down at the end there. The Detroit building skyline has started to explode, but we're just getting started. Here's Campus Martius in 1900. It's a park with horses. 20 years later, it's parking. No horses. And you can see that also a bunch of the other buildings have come up. The Dime Bank building is kind of behind the new Pontchartrain. And I don't know, did I show it here? Notice that the Pontchartrain Hotel, which is right in the center there, was built, and 10 years later they added several more stories to it. And a few years later, it was so outdated that they tore it down. That building only lasted about 20 years. Detroit is growing at an incredible pace. I threw this in just because I was down there last year in the very same spot, shot the picture. Now it's half park and half parking. So we're kind of back. This is a great shot taken from the top of the David Stott building, which is on Capitol Park. So about 6 or 8 blocks off of the river, looking toward the river. You can see that the Guardian building's up. We do see the Ford building. Unfortunately, we don't see the Penobscot building, which is up at this time. The National Bank of Detroit building is there. It's a great picture just showing how tall Detroit has gotten in a really short time. I also like pointing out the dredge right there in the middle of the river. That is busy digging the hole to put the tunnel in. So we're thinking about transportation also. This picture was taken about 1955, but it might as well have been 1930. This is what Detroit looked like when the crash occurred. This is the skyline that, short of maybe the city-county building in Cobo Hall, this is the skyline I grew up with. It wasn't until the Yamasaki gas building went up that we really had a building that changed this portrait, and that was about a good 20 years. One of the things I like to point out, I mentioned the conventions, but Detroit was a hot music town. It was started as a hot music town in the 1890s, real ragtime town, and it changed into a real jazz town. And we had 2 of the finest dance bands in the country touring out of Detroit. This is McKinney's Cotton Pickers, started as McKinney's Cincos, but you know, anybody who's into jazz, look at the names who are playing in that band, who cut their teeth playing in the McKinney's Cotton Pickers. And if that's not enough, we got Gene Goldkett's band, which had, actually he's responsible for 3 bands, the Casa Loma Orchestra, the Victor Recording Orchestra, and then the Gene Goldkett Orchestra, which he toured with. And again, you look at the names across the bottom, these are the guys who were important in jazz from 1920 right through 1950. This is important stuff for Detroiters because I don't think they realize we had music before Motown. Just a couple of the big buildings we got. Detroit's Masonic Temple was the biggest Masonic temple, and I believe remains so, in the world. 42 or 43 lodges inside, 2 big ballrooms, 2 small auditoriums, and 1 huge auditorium, 2 cathedrals, and just an incredible building. There's over 1,000 rooms in this building, and it's a beautiful place. We're actually having our Detroit Historical Society ball here this year, which is not why I put this picture in. I just thought I'd throw that in. That should be a whole lot of fun. Of course, Michigan Central Station, the most photographed of our eyesores these days, ruin porn, I think it's been called. A neat idea, a beautiful building, classical architecture, of course, down at street level, but it was kind of a mistake. Chicago didn't make that mistake. Philadelphia, New York, nobody moved their train station out of the center of town. Detroit did. It was easier for the railroads. There was a junction there that worked very well for them. That was also very close to the entrance to the railroad tunnel that went under the river. So it worked really well for the railroads, not so well for the people who wanted to get to it. They didn't plan enough parking just because it was 1913, I think, when they built it. The car hadn't really made its mark yet. So never completely finished. Still with us, gorgeous building. I hope to fix it. We also had the Detroit Institute of Arts went up that time, right across the street, Cass Gilbert's Detroit Public Library, and then a drugstore. I threw this in just because this is what a drugstore looked like in 1925, 1930. Okay? There was enough enthusiasm for architecture in Detroit that that's what you did. I don't see a CVS doing that today, which is really unfortunate, but it just emphasizes what the aesthetic was when we were looking at architecture. I mentioned the tunnel, and I've got a picture of that. We've also put in a bridge. This is 1929, 1930. We put in a tunnel between the two cities. It was wonderful. By 1930, the Rouge plant was the largest manufacturing complex in the world. We can't get away from that. Again, we're back to smoky, foggy forges, hard work. This is what Detroit was built on. When we say blue collar, imagine picking out the building you work in there. This would have been a tough place to go to work, but this was the way Detroit worked. Looking upriver, we had a working waterfront. There weren't any parks. Right down to, there was a train station to this is basically where the Renaissance Center is, where the grain elevator is there. The Robin Hood grain elevator was there till 1960 at least, with train tracks and ferries running across. Up the way, you can just see Belle Isle in the background, but that was a working waterfront right through 1980. Other cities, Chicago, Milwaukee, they had parks on their waterfront. We used every inch of it. You look downriver, this is the other side of the rail end, the rail heads. We had rail ferries, 4 different rail ferries were running 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, 18 to 24 cars across every half hour. Detroit was a major rail town, which is something we kind of forget, but it really took up some of our best real estate. So that's where we were. Growing, building, vibrant, great music, great arts, lots of stuff was going on, and then came Prohibition. Good or bad? Well, arguing both ways, but I'll argue it was in our blood. First of all, it was a natural opportunity. From the bottom of the Detroit River to the top of the St. Clair River, about 90 miles. The area in the middle, Lake St. Clair, is about 20 miles long, and it gets about 20 miles wide, but the rest of it's only about a mile wide. As far as a border, very hard to defend. And I mentioned it was in our blood. Europeans loved to smuggle. It was a sport. The English, the Dutch, the French, the Germans, the Scots, the Irish, they smuggled kind of as I mentioned, as a sport. It was something they did. Cadillac. He was here in 1701. He had gotten kicked out by 1710 because he was smuggling furs back into France. Of course, the owner of the furs was the king. He kind of made the wrong guy mad. During the Underground Railroad period, and even prior to that, Detroit was a smuggling place for people. Originally, the flow went from Canada into the United States. Before 1832, when the British outlawed slavery, there were some fairly large slaveholding farms down in southern Ontario, kind of the Leamington area. There were a couple of big farms, 175 or 100 people were kept there as forced labor. And when they escaped to Michigan, where slavery was outlawed by the Northwest Convention in 1787. Once the British outlawed slavery and the things like the Fugitive Slave Act came into play, the flow went very much the other way, so that Detroit became a center for people wanting to get to Canada, to freedom. They'd often come by railroad. Although we laugh at the notion of the Underground Railroad, most of them walked. Some of them took wagons. Some of them would get on boats down in Toledo or in Sandusky. And oddly enough, those boats always tended to run out of wood about the time they got to Amherstburg in Canada. And if people got off in Canada, then the guys driving the boats didn't really care. The Detroit River would often see 900 people a day crossing over into Canada during the good parts of the year. But they'd be crossing all year round, crossing on the ice, crossing in rowboats, swimming. People were very interested in getting across. So then we got to Prohibition. Michigan was the first. Back before the Civil War, Michigan passed Prohibition. It was very popular in the rural areas, very unpopular in the urban areas, and this became a pattern that remained right the whole way through. You should remember that as we think about Detroit during Prohibition, Detroit's population started with the French, right? And then we had some Scots come in, and then we had some Irish, and we had some Germans. And after that, we had some Poles and Italians and Russians And most of these are societies that have alcohol as part of their general culture. Whether it's a beer for the Irish or whether it's a bottle of wine on the table for the French, alcohol was popular in Detroit. It always was. It just wasn't outstate. The first prohibition got repealed after the Civil War. It was a national movement. About every 2 or 3 years, something was introduced into the Michigan legislature to pass prohibition again. Remember, Hiram Walker was not a Canadian. Hiram Walker was a Detroiter. Hiram Walker knew that prohibition was coming. Hiram Walker put his distillery in Walkerville, Ontario. Michigan did pass prohibition. It was the first state to pass its own prohibition, 1917. This was overturned the following year by a Supreme Court. But in that interim, people in Detroit figured out how to get booze. Most of it came up from Ohio. The old Dixie Highway was the way you got alcohol into Detroit at that point. Mostly in cars, but lots of creative ways. It was a real start to getting us into the rest. 18th Amendment, 1919, was passed. It was backed up by the Volstead Act, which was the enabling act in 1920. Washingtonians, the guys in the legislature, figured that everybody would embrace prohibition. Everybody thought this was a good idea. And in fact, there were a lot of people in Detroit that thought it was a good idea, not the majority. So they didn't really put any funds toward the enforcement of prohibition, which made it all the easier for the guys that were doing the smuggling. By 1927, reinforcements came in the form of money and coordination. Coordination was important. We had at least 7 different police agencies during the beginning of Prohibition that weren't even talking to each other. The Coast Guard, the Customs, the Revenue Service, the Michigan State Police, Detroit Police, local police. None of these guys talked to each other. There was no coordination in the enforcement acts of enforcing. That changed in 27, and more money was allotted. So the Coast Guard actually got bigger boats, and they got bigger guns. That was an important part. 21st Amendment changed the whole thing. Last day of 1933 was to be the end of Prohibition. How did we get to this point? They'd been arguing about it for a while, and this was kind of the side that said we'd really like to have it. We'd like to have prohibition passed. It was the subtler side was over there on the left. Let's keep the young men out of the saloons was the subtle way. The less subtle way was the cartoon of Dad sitting at a bar table with his head on his arm and the empty bottle of booze sitting there and the little girl tagging at his arm saying, "Daddy, come home for dinner." They had all kinds of those cartoons too. So that was one way of going about it. The less subtle way was Carrie Nation, of course, who would walk into bars with a hatchet and just start breaking things. And I really thought that she was doing this from the highest possible reason, for the best reasons at all. But then I noticed that she's got a managing agency that's mentioned twice on the poster, probably an advance man that went ahead to make sure she got all the publicity she could get. The other side of the coin, of course, and this is a German beer distributor, a guy who owns a bar, is passing out these postcards. My favorite on the left is the woman breastfeeding with the Lager's Amber Fluid Mild gives health and strength to wife and child. Why not? Or the young lad with youngster with ruddy good cheer serenely sips his lager beer. We laugh, but this was truth. People served beer to their children. People served wine at the dinner table, and everybody at the table had some. We're kind of, we're looking at this with a presentist eye, but if you go back, for those cultures that had come over and had alcohol use as part and parcel as eating meat and potatoes, this wasn't so funny. This was, come on, I can get behind this. I can vote for this. That's where they stood. So 3 things most people don't know about are the Canadian factor, the exceptions, and the unintended consequences. Canadian factor, provincial situation. We'll talk about that in a second. The exceptions, there were exceptions. If you had grapes, you could make wine. If you had a church, you could have sacramental wines, of course. And then there was industrial alcohols used for cleaning machine parts and that kind of thing. So alcohol was being produced in the United States during Prohibition. Unintended consequences, well, the good part was every convention in the country came to Detroit. This was the place to go. If you didn't go to Chicago, Detroit was better, it was cheaper. The bad side, corruption in the police department, corruption in the courts, and the crime level was through the roof. It really was. Best of times, worst of times. So the Canadian factor, this is always fun. During World War I, the Canadians had complete prohibition. All of the alcohol made had to go toward the war effort. When that was done, it was decided that each province could decide how they wanted their laws written. Of course, the folks in Quebec, very strong French population, they said, everything, of course. Everything was open. The saloons were open, the bars were open, the hotels had alcohol, you could buy it on the corner, you could make your own, no problem. Ontario, not so easy. What the Ontarians did was close the saloons and bars and said, you can have alcohol for your personal consumption. You have to buy it from Quebec, which was great if you wanted to order your wine and liquor, beer from Quebec. And you can make it. If you want to make it, you can make all you want. You can make it by the barrel, by the gallon. You just can't sell it in Canada, which was fine with Hiram Walker, with Detroit right across the border. It all worked very well, and the Canadians would export, the Ontario coffers were full. The excise taxes, because of course these were all legal exports. You'd load up your boat, whether it was a rowboat or a freighter, you'd load it up, you'd sign an excise tax form, you'd pay the Canadian government, the Ontario government, for that outgoing liquor, and that liquor would go, and they wouldn't care where it went. Oddly enough, a lot of the liquor that was smuggled out of Windsor turned around and went right back into Ontario because it was cheaper to buy it from the guys smuggling it into Ontario than it was to buy it from Quebec. So a large percentage of the liquor in Canada got smuggled into Canada. It's the darndest thing, this prohibition. Eventually, the U.S. puts enough pressure on the Canadian authorities that they promise that they will notify the U.S. when a shipment is leaving that looks like it's going to the United States, right? The problem being that by the time the guy writes up the writ, goes up to his office, calls across the way to the police department, and they get somebody down to the dock, it's probably already been unloaded. They put a little more pressure on, and eventually they closed the export docks. You couldn't export to the United States anymore. So if you were loading up your boat and the guy came down from customs and said, where are you taking that? You'd say Puerto Rico. And he'd write Puerto Rico on the manifest. You'd pay him, now they've doubled the excise tax, you'd pay him twice the amount, and he'd take the money and he was happy to go. And you'd take off to Puerto Rico. And if he ran into you in the hardware store later in the day or church on Sunday the next day, he didn't care, okay? It was making money for Ontario. They were happy. They didn't ask any questions. They did reopen their saloons in 1927. They realized it was stupid to be exporting their own booze by smuggling it. I mentioned that we had the fastest boats in the world. This was a good thing when it came to smuggling across a river, especially when there's railroad tracks running right next to the river so that you could load up your boat right out of a rail car. And back in the old days, this is looking at the waterfront in Detroit. You can see that it's rather sawtoothed. It's jagged. There were lots of places to go. Today it's all riprap or it's all steel seawall. Back then, there were places to hide, especially up on the Near East Side. Alter Road is kind of on the right side of that picture, and that's the border between Grosse Pointe and Detroit, and there's basically a little Venice in there. There are canals running up into that neighborhood, so if you could get away from Hiram Walker, your boat would probably have you into the canal in about 2 minutes. You pull into a boathouse, pull the boathouse door down, turn off the engine, and you're done, okay? The opportunities were wonderful. This is the foot of Riopelle, where the immigration, or the Border Patrol guys had their boats. You notice that every one of those boats is different. These are all confiscated rum runners. Okay, the boat might be 2-3 years old, but it's fine, it's floating, you paint it black, and you're all set. Except that the cops are running last year's boat, and the rum runners are running this year's boat. So they're a step behind there. One of the tricks in the trade was to not use your boat, but pull a barge behind it full of booze. So if you saw the cops coming, you let the barge go and you took off and you got away scot-free. So what the guys would do is once they threw all the alcohol overboard, and I think I got a picture of them doing that here, they just tossed it into the river. They didn't break the bottles, so if you really wanted to dive down and get them, you could recover them, and lots of kids did. Coleman Young wrote about it in his autobiography. You could do that. But once they got all the booze out of the barge, they'd auction off the barge to raise money, right? Congress hadn't given any money, so they auctioned off the barge. Who do you think the guys on the right are? Okay? Who do you think's standing in line to buy a barge? I think I can answer that question. Cops tried a few things where Detroit was innovative in its use of radio. The Detroit Police Department had a broadcast station in the upstairs, the third floor of the Belle Isle Police Station. And it was the first time they had used radio to contact police cars in the United States. It was just a send only. They'd send the report from the top of the Belle Isle Police Station to this car, which could receive it, and then could go to wherever the reported drop site was. There were two problems there. One was that the reported drop site, if it was Rye Appel, the real drop site was down at Joseph Campo. Okay, so it didn't always work in that regard. But worse than that, if you read the first line, the head of the Belle Isle Police Station has been arrested because he's been helping the rum runners smuggle the booze in. And over on the right side, it actually says that the worst part was that the Detroit News got a picture of rum runners landing booze at a dock that was only a couple of blocks away from the headquarters of the Border Patrol. So no matter what they were doing, they were having a seriously hard time doing it. And the rum runners, they were trying everything. You know, once the ice froze, and it used to freeze a lot harder, you could run a car across the ice, especially in the lower Detroit River. This, I think, was Lake St. Clair. And I know that happened because the police divers dive on a Mack truck right off the Dawson Museum that's on the bottom full of beer. It's a kind of a graduation ceremony for their graduating classes, is to go down and get a bottle of beer off that truck and come up. So it worked that way. The cops tried everything. This is a Grosse Pointe Farms cop. He's in an ice boat, which would go faster than the car, okay? But they're pretty tippy. And how you would shoot at the car going in an ice boat, I'm not sure how that worked. You could certainly keep up with them, but how would you arrest them? We had ferries that ran across between Detroit and Windsor every couple of minutes. 5 to 10 minutes depending on the ferry and the schedule. They'd carry cars, they'd carry people. We had, I mentioned, the rail ferries carrying people back and forth. Any one of those cars could be full of thousands of dollars of booze. And just to make things easier, in 1929 and 1930, we built them a bridge and a tunnel to drive between Windsor and Detroit. We really were not helping the police. There was not enough money at the border to stop any of this. They figured that out of 70% of the alcohol that Canada made that was consumed in the United States came in through southeastern Michigan. 70%. Of that, they figure they stopped 5%. Now, these are all speculations because, of course, rum runners, like pirates, don't leave paperwork, they don't leave bookwork, but they've been able to pretty much extrapolate from the amount that was made and the amount that came over here exactly how that worked. There were lots of ways of smuggling. The woman on the left, of course, she's bootlegging. That's what it is. And I haven't bought one in a long time, but if you buy a little pint bottle of liquor, I think it's still got the curve on the back. Either fits your back pocket or it fits your boot. The woman in the middle has got just a regular water bottle strapped over her back, and the woman on the right has added some darn contraptions to her thighs. And you throw a coat over the top of that, and you can just walk on and off those ferries. You can walk across the bridge at this point, getting in and out. There were so many other ways. I could go on for minutes about the different ways people smuggled. This just being kind of one of the more unusual, a torpedo that you'd put a few cases of whiskey in and drag it on the cable across the river. They did this down at Alter Road near Grosse Pointe. They did this down at Gros Isle. Think Christmas trees wrapped up very tightly coming down from Canada. What's stuffed in the branches? It eventually became a bit of a farce, and the cartoons started coming out that, this was just not working. We try the enforcement. It's not happening. We're trying to stop it. Is the flood going down? Yeah, the fisherman agrees. The flood is going down. Home brewing, of course, I mentioned the exceptions. Production of beer and liquor, 1 million gallons a year just here in Detroit. Thousands of gallons of legal wine. This is okay, but my favorite is the industrial alcohol production, up by 400%. We weren't making that many more cars, but we were making that much more alcohol. So it was pretty much out of control. And then we had the brewers. Now, happily, I've looked at the brewers and the bars before and after Prohibition. And most of the brewers who were in business before Prohibition reopened afterwards, with the exception of 2, and they were replaced by 2. So the market was back to full. Most of the bars that were open before Prohibition, there were about 1,700 taverns, they called them, were open before Prohibition. Most of those reopened after Prohibition. But the real trick was, one of the real cruxes here, is the Detroit speakeasies just grew and grew and grew. We have an exhibit down at the museum now called Out on the Town, Dining and Drinking in Detroit. And I went around and talked to a lot of the bar owners, the small bar owners and some of the old bar owners and they all invariably said we were a speakeasy during Prohibition. And I say, sure you were. They all were. They might have had a grocery upstairs that kind of served as a cover, or they even just closed the door and put the close sign up and you came in the back door. But speakeasies were everywhere. They were in office buildings on the 13th floor. They were in funeral homes in the back room that nobody ever went into. I'll talk to people after speaking like this, and they'll come up and say, my grandmother had one in the basement, or my uncle was always tuning up Model Ts for running across the ice. Everybody was involved in Prohibition because they didn't really think it was that wrong. There was a cadre of people, a very small group of people, of which the Booths were some, of which the Algers were some. There were a lot of money behind the Prohibition era, but most of the people in Detroit didn't think it was such a great idea. And I like to compare. I just mentioned there were 1,700 taverns before Prohibition. During Prohibition, you could buy a beer in 25,000 places. Not very good. Now, if we wanted to talk ephemera, Leslie was absolutely right. Speakeasies didn't advertise, at least not on billboards or on the radio. But they did have speakeasy cards that they would hand out, which was basically kind of a membership card, and it was the kind of thing that would get you in the door. And we've got a nice collection of those. My favorite quote here from Malcolm Bengay of the Free Press: it was impossible to get a drink in Detroit unless you walked at least 10 feet and told the busy bartender in a voice loud enough for him to hear you above the uproar what you wanted. It wasn't hard to get a drink in Detroit. The biggest downside probably was the growth of organized crime in Detroit. Lots of gangs, mostly by local ethnicity. They got started by the German Oakland Sugar House Gang, which was up on Oakland Street, but those guys mentored the Purple Gang, which is probably the most famous of the gangs. The Purple Gang started as a bunch of toughs, young toughs, rolling drunks and that kind of stuff, and then they got into the protection racket, and then they got into the numbers racket, and then they got into running booze. And they became the biggest name, but they weren't the only name. The Italian families, because there were so many Italian neighborhoods, really got into it, and these guys were waiting when the Purples went bad. And also the Irish gangs, the Russian gangs, every neighborhood had somebody who was working. Many of them were working for the Purples, and these are the Purples. They don't look so happy. I think they've been arrested. They were not very smart. Again, they were young guys. They were very, very brash. They would shoot people in open daylight with witnesses. They really didn't care. It eventually got half of them killed and half of them sent to jail. They were the most notorious, and there's a couple of people who do wonderful presentations on the history of the Purples. But I'd like to remember that the people who lasted were not the Purples. They were the Italians. This is the Licavoli family. These guys look a lot happier than those last guys, right? Okay? These were the guys that really got things done. And it changed how the whole thing happened. Huge business, $215 million a year. Second only to the automobile business. And after the crash, it wasn't even that. It was what kept a lot of people with bread on the table. Profits were justifying everything from the cars to the boats. Hijacking became the mode. You weren't the guy running the boat across with the liquor. You waited until other sucker ran the boat across with the liquor, and then you took it. Okay, that's how the operations ended up running because of the convention business. And you got to remember, I keep mentioning that, but the Statler, the Tuller, the Book Cadillac, the Leland, the Pickford Shelby were all built in the 1920s, and they were all built because we had convention business coming here to Detroit. They didn't come for the music. As good as the music was, they didn't come for the music. They came for the booze, and eventually they came for the prostitution and the gambling. Detroit really got to be a Wild West town. I can run through the growth of corruption. Hamtramck and E-Course mayors ran rackets, and everybody knew it. They didn't care. They went to the E-Course mayor had, I think, the Green Lantern Tavern. That was the place you went, because that's where the good booze was. The mayor brought it in. 34,000 Detroit police officers arrested, only 8,000 of them went to jail. 1,600 Coast Guard guys, these are guys who are coming in from outstate, got cited locally, and then the public drunkenness was really getting out of hand. Well, and worse than that, people were getting shot in the street. They were getting shot in the neighborhoods. There was like Jerry Buckley. Jerry Buckley was a radio personality who supposedly had underworld ties, but was kind of blowing the whistle on the gangs, the mobs. And four guys walked in, two to guard the door. They walked into the Detroiter hotel and just shot him sitting right in the lobby. Nobody was ever convicted. Nobody was ever caught. The Boblo boat. Rum runner was running from the cops. He decided to use the Boblo boat as protection. So as the Boblo boat went upriver, the rum runner's running around the boat, the cops are running around behind him. Cops started shooting, hit a guy on the Boblo boat, didn't kill him, but they hit him, and that really started to change people's attitudes. If they weren't already shifting, they were starting to shift big. There were questions of constitutional rights. People were getting pulled over when they were out fishing or duck hunting. They were getting pulled over for almost no reason at all. Detroit was getting a reputation as absolutely a Wild West town. Cops in the bars, hookers on the corners. Detroit was the place you wanted to go for that Wild West feel. That didn't go over so well with the people who really got Prohibition started. This was a group that Mrs. Russell Alger was way behind, really involved in. And again, the Algers were behind Prohibition. They supported the abolition of alcohol. But after a while, they figured it wasn't working, and they started petitioning to repeal it. And in fact, it did get repealed. In 1933, the repeal was supposed to take effect the last day, but you see, this is May. As soon as that repeal was passed, the passes started getting written, and this is the American Legion Convention coming in, and in 8 hours drank 300 half barrels and 500 cases of beer. Mr. Stroh is happy to serve that beer. I think he had his factory up and running within a week of the bill passing. So it was a wild time in Detroit. I'd like to point out two things, and then I'll let you go. There were a lot of groups doing wonderful things here in Detroit. Of course, the Masons have been around since the British, but 1911, the Exchange Club was founded, the Kiwanis Club was founded in 15, and the Newsboys in 1914. These were groups that were going out and helping poor people, people who had come up here, got a real low-end job in a factory, were working their fingers to the bone. These guys were helping. I also mentioned all the people who had come in, all the different ethnic organizations or ethnic people that had come in. A lot of those were Catholic, either Roman Catholic or Orthodox Catholic, but Detroit at this time was 70 to 75% Roman Catholic. I'll just go with Catholic. But the Knights of St. John, the Knights of Columbus, the Knights of Malta were all here and also active in doing good during this very, very ugly time of Prohibition. Unfortunately, we also had the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Detroit was the center for Klan activity north of Tennessee. They would have marches of 10,000 people up and down Woodward Avenue. They burned crosses on both the courthouse and the city hall. They were active in all of the auto plants. They were a big, big business here in Detroit. The guy on the right, he's part of the Black Legion, which was kind of like the Klan's dumber younger cousin. Started in Ohio, came to Detroit, and kind of died here. But we forget that the 1920s, as wonderful as things were, as people were getting into this middle class and getting an income that allowed them to step up and really become part of the middle class, there were also people that were making life pretty difficult for other segments of the population here, notably the Catholics and the blacks. I just throw this in to show the shift in population. Polish and German were the huge part of our population for many, many decades. That's where they came. And most of these are Western Europeans, a few Eastern Europeans. And this is 1910, I think. And then 20 years later, first of all, the Canadians have become a huge part of our immigrant population, which we don't think of. But part of my family came from Canada. The Germans have stepped down, and the black population has stepped way up. Prior to this, the black population was less than 1%. Within 20 years, it's now 7%, relegated to 1% of the property in town as far as where they could live. That's a whole nother story. But you'll also notice near the bottom that we've started getting the Eastern Europeans have started moving in. So this is just a huge time, a big change in Detroit. And I bring this up just because this is kind of the skyline we've got now, and we can see a lot of those iconic buildings. But we can also think of a lot of the problems that we're dealing with in Detroit today, the growth of Detroit. Detroit's 138.6 square miles. It's massive. You can pick, I think, Boston, Manhattan, and Baltimore, pick them up and set them right into the middle of Detroit without even changing the borders. Detroit is massive. The ethnic problems, the problems of immigrants coming in and trying to deal with each other, the problems of both blacks and whites coming up from the South and trying to deal with each other, I think are things we're still dealing with today. So the 1920s had a lot to do with the Detroit we live in today. Was it an exciting time? Damn right it was. It was pretty cool. I gotta believe being here would have been pretty nuts. Was it any different than some of the challenges we've got today? I think it was probably more challenging then than it is today. And I think we ought to think of that as we look forward. It's always nice to look back to see where you've been, to see where the opportunities are for going. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and I really appreciate you having me here to tell you about it. A lot of fun. Did you guys need questions, or did you want to?
Yeah, what I think we'll do is we'll head down towards where the letterhead show is, and
Oh.
Joe will be down there